Hawkins, before we get into the meat of your book, I Am Nobody's Slave: How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. First off, this was a tough book to read, so I can only imagine what it was like to write it. What made you decide to write about your family behind the shutters?
When I was a young boy, probably 6 years old, that was when I saw Alex Haley's Roots with my parents, incidentally, sitting on the couch over my shoulder. And there was that real vicious scene of Kunta Kinte taking the whip as a result of refusing to take on the name of the enslaver. And at that time, that was the first connection that I made between the belt and the whip. But I also was very profoundly curious about my family's time in America and how we got here, and also my father's time in Alabama, because it was something that he wouldn't talk about when I was growing up. Yet he would have nightmares, and I would ask him in the morning, "Dad, what were you talking about? Or what were you dreaming about?" And he would say, "Alabama." But he would never talk that much about Alabama. And so, being a kid in Minnesota, I was always aware that something tragic had happened in Alabama. And when I became eventually an investigative reporter, I recognized that there were so many things that I was able to investigate in my career, but I couldn't tell anybody the first thing about my family history. And I think so from 6 years old to becoming a person who had the resources and the ability to do this story, that made me want to dig in. And when Ancestry.com came into existence, it just exploded, and that made the opportunity a viable one.
The first 180 pages of your book are about your childhood, and you write that my first full memory is that of my dad chasing me around the duplex as I darted across a hardwood floor, seized by terror. What was going on?
Well, that was American discipline. And I'll add to that Black American discipline, which was informed by my father and mother's belief that if they didn't use harsh punishment with me, that I could make mistakes out in the world and that the world wouldn't be so kind to me. They were very afraid of police. They were very afraid of people in the white people in the neighborhood. They were very hyper vigilant and very hyper cautious about our family being harmed. It was almost like a PTSD effect that stemmed from my father's time in Alabama. And I don't call it post traumatic anymore because I recognize that the trauma really never stopped for them. And that was part of the American story of our family that's lost on a lot of people. There are many, many African American people who descend from Jim Crow segregation who believe devoutly in corporal punishment of children, especially because corporal punishment is legal in 17 states in public schools in America. My father received the paddle when he was a kid, and it's also not illegal to beat your kids in America. I mean, I know that there are reporting requirements and things now, but back in the 80s, it was all, I mean, hey, there were all kinds of kids of all races were getting it, but I think that disproportionately there was a strong belief in the Black community and the Black Baptist Church that the belt was the way to keep a child in line. And at that time, I didn't realize how that related to history.
Tell us how Leroy Hawkins Sr. and Roberta Hawkins ended up in Maplewood, Minnesota.
It's a classic story of Black flight from the inner city communities all over the nation right after it, from the 1960s all the way to the 80s. We saw millions of Black families begin to make that reverse migration into American suburbs. And it was just a classic American dream story that my parents wanted that for us. And their perception was that, well, we knew that the schools in the cities, not as much in Minnesota, but were underfunded, and there wouldn't be opportunities like there would be in the suburbs. They wanted a place where They were insulated somewhat. They believed they'd be insulated from crime and things like that. And so we lived in a very sedate, strongly solid class community. And they ended up there because there were black families who had moved out there before us. My grandmother was there, my grandfather was there, and that was their belief that we were going to be able to participate more fully in the American dream if we lived in America's suburbs. But we still kept a strong bond and connection to the black community.
To Mount Olivet Baptist Church in St. Paul.
Yeah. Yeah, crazy. I mean, Mount Olivet Baptist Church, that was a place that really informed my whole existence in terms of my worldview, my belief that I could achieve things in this world, and the belief in social justice and civil rights. Because the black church, of course, as you know, was the center of all of that. And a lot of those people at Mount Olivet Baptist Church were the people who did the Great Migration north. And so I'll tell you a little story. I know that when I was growing up, we would show up to church. And if we got there early enough, the elders would be in front of the church as people were still coming in. And I mean the elders. I mean, these people were, Peter, these people were 100 years old, some of them in their 90s and up. And that was their time in the service. And they would just sing, and they would be singing. And then the whole church would come in, you know. And at that time, I didn't realize that those were literally songs that were straight out of the hymnals in the fields, and that these were people who were the children and grandchildren of enslaved people. And I think that being mentored by a lot of those people, even though I had a lot of hardship in my early childhood, told me that I could accomplish anything. And though if I could go back today and hug those people, I would, because they believed in me devoutly.
From your book, in the Hawkins household, there were 1,000 missteps that could provoke a painful whipping. However, the 7 deadly sins were consistently clear: disobeying or disrespecting my mother; 2, disobeying or disrespecting my father; 3, asking questions; 4, receiving a behavior-related note or call from school; 5, upsetting any white person my parents were wary of; 6, not finishing chores perfectly; and 7, embarrassing my mother. How often did you commit the 7 deadly sins?
Oh man, all the time. I think when I was a kid, I was probably whipped over 100 times, well over 100 times. I was a very curious boy, and I think the prevailing wisdom was that black children should be seen and not heard, which was again a holdover from enslavement and Jim Crow. And so the idea of questioning was something that, you know, back previous generations could get someone sold away or could get someone killed. You know, if your mother told you, stand here and don't move in the antebellum period, that really meant something. That meant that if you move, you could be sold away to another plantation. And that wasn't that far from, it was only 2 generations earlier. And so, because it was my great great grandparents who were actually enslaved. And so I didn't know that. All I knew growing up was that if I asked too many questions, if I said no to my parents, if I questioned any aspect of upbringing, and if I fell short of excellence, the price was going to be physical violence. And that was the case for me and many of my friends.
Number 1 song on the Hawkins playlist: You're Going to Get Us All Killed. Boy, those white people will come and kill us all. What did your parents mean by that?
Well, they meant just that. I mean, they actually did believe, you know, we were, just to put it into context, I was born in 1971, so 7 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so even though Peter, I love the country and I'm proud to be an American, I consider myself a first generation American because my ancestors, so I have Revolutionary War soldiers as ancestors and ancestors on both sides of the Civil War. I am the first person and part of the first generation in my family to be born equal to a white person, unlike my father. And so my father's Jim Crow experience um, had a lot of death in it and a lot of loss and a lot of grief. It was so different from what I was taught Jim Crow was. Jim Crow was segregation in the textbooks I was taught in school. And the worst of it, we believed, was that black people had to drink out of separate water fountains or that black people had to sit in the back of the bus. What I did not know at the time, and as you find out in the book, that I've had a murder in my family every generation since 1837, including my grandfather and both of my grandparents' fathers when they were 5 and 9 years old, respectively. And so I didn't know. We looked at our parents like they were just absolutely crazy when they would say, "You could get us all killed." I could get you all killed because I upset a teacher. But what we didn't know is that we had this bloody reality of so many family members, generation after generation, being murdered, and that my father was still very profoundly impacted by the memory of Jim Crow.
Lee Hawkins, Maplewood, Minnesota was probably what, 95% white when you moved there. You tell the story of attending at 5 years old a white birthday party. What is that story?
Yeah, so that was, I was an outsider when I was a kindergartner. I remember that. I was called the N word a lot. And, this idea that children don't know racism and they come into the world pure. Well, they're socialized even before they can talk to believe certain things, right, in terms of race. And so even black children internalize racism. And so I found that out the hard way. And there was a time where I was so socially, um, I was so socially isolated that I was coming home on the bus one day, and I was going to school half day because I was a kindergartner. And this little kid had a wrapped birthday gift. And I saw the gift and I said, "Hey, why don't you open happy birthday? Why don't you open your gift and see what it is?" And he said, "Well, actually, I'm going to a party. It's not for me." And he was talking about this kid and everything. And then he invited me to come to the party. "Why don't you come with?" And I said, "Well, I wasn't invited." "Ah, it doesn't matter." And so I wanted ice cream. So I went to this party. And I went to this party with this kid. And it's actually surprising. His mother, the mother of the kid whose party it was like, "Oh, who is this? Who do we have here?" She's a white lady. Everybody at the party was white. And they welcomed me with open arms. But they said, "But we do need to call your mother to let her know where you are." So back then they had the big phone books and everything. And they found my mother's number in the phone book, my parents' number in the phone book, and they called my mother. And at that point, I recognized the big mistake that I had made. I mean, I was in the middle of a game of pin the tail on the donkey, but my mom came and said, "No, I'm coming to get him now," right? And so when she came to get me, that was, the apology to the women. And when we got back out to the car, that was when I saw it was almost like a Jekyll and Hyde moment. I saw a side of my mother that I'd never seen before. "How dare you go to this party? Where were you, boy? Where were you, boy?" And the whole idea was that I had not only embarrassed my family by not having the social couth to, only go to a party if I'm invited, but also that I had embarrassed the family by, just being there. And so I was severely beaten for the first time when my father got home. And my father's concern was primarily not that I went to the party and violated the rules, but "You could have gone missing. They could have did anything to you. And while my mother was more concerned about the social aspect, my dad was once again very locked in this Alabama mentality. And I think in that specific part of the book, I say he literally beat the child out of me because I think he needed to teach me, or he felt he needed to teach me that lesson.
Read, this is a pretty lengthy, but I want to read what you wrote in the book about that incident. This is your mother. Boy, don't you ever embarrass our family like that again. Don't you know these white people don't want you in their home, she said, speaking so sternly that some of her spit flew into my eye. That boy didn't invite you to that party. He doesn't even know you. And you go waltzing in there like these white people want you there? And you had the nerve to ask these white people for ice cream? What are they going to think about us with you begging for food? We have food. They're going to spread this all over the neighborhood. Those white women are going to say those ends didn't have food. Don't you know you're an end to them? Are you stupid or something? You're an embarrassment to this family, boy. Wait till I get you home. Then she slapped me hard across the face. But I knew that that was just the opening act. The main event was yet to come. Dad would be biting his tongue for sure. But when he got home, he didn't pull out his belt immediately. He grabbed me and shook me hard, then put both hands on my shoulders, pressing down with his thumbs digging into my neck. He launched into a screaming lecture, adding frightening dimensions that Mom hadn't even brought up. Then he unbuckled his belt and brought it down on my back, hard. Boy, don't you ever disappear like that. Whap, whap, whap. Don't you know that you could disappear and never be seen again? They'll kill you. Whap, 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 whap. Don't whap, you whap, whap. Know that some of these white people, whap, 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 will kill you if you go into their homes. And then I won't have a son. You're not a kid. Whap. You can't be a kid. Whap, whap. Stop acting like a kid. Whap, whap, whap. You're not a white kid. You're black, boy. Don't you know you're black? You're black. And don't you ever forget it. Whap, 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 whap. I was 5 years old. Would you like to hear that read out loud to you?
Well, I read it out loud in readings, and it's always an emotional read. And I wanted to do that. I wanted people to know the severity and the facts, because this was not something that was isolated to me. This is something that happens in homes all the time. And being tied to that fear that my dad had brings it in such focus, sharp focus, in ways that it didn't when I was a kid, because I didn't have any of the information that I really needed. My dad wouldn't talk about it, and I think that if he would have sat me down um, and really told me, let me tell you what happened to my dad. Let me tell you what happened to his dad. And let me tell you why you can't go to a party. I think I would have responded in the productive way that he wanted me to, but he couldn't be rational about it. And I guess when I hear that, because I know that my father was not like the Troy Maxon character in August Wilson's Fences, when his son comes to him and says, "Why haven't you ever liked me?" I knew that my dad liked me. I knew that because my dad was an omnipresent father. But if I would have had the whole story, we wouldn't have gone through the horrific periods, those really difficult periods of beatings. And I think that, for anybody who's watching this broadcast who's from the South, we have to come to terms with the extent to which violence is part of the founding of this country. And whether we're talking about the genocide of the indigenous people or the enslavement of black people or even the flogging tradition of women and the flogging tradition of children and how it was all integrated into the criminal justice system. If we can't come to terms with that, we can never really make progress on domestic violence or the violence that we still see against children in schools. And so at that time, when I hear it, when I hear you read it like that, and I still believe that I'm passionate, if not self-righteous, about drawing these connections because it really did take a lot out of me as a kid. And at the time, I didn't know about the effects that it has on the parasympathetic nervous system. But in the anxiety that I dealt with a lot in my adult life, years after that attack, as a result of the many other beatings that I took, I now know, and with the studying that I've done into adverse childhood experiences and how that can then hardwire your body for cortisol production and everything, I recognize the role that that plays in the shortening of life expectancy and everything. And so when you read that, all of the connections just come flooding back. And the good thing is that I've been able to get it down on paper so that I can begin to evangelize across the country to help people start to understand that children, even though they're the most vulnerable people in our nation, they have the least protection. And I'd like to see that change.
Lee Hawkins, what were the poisons?
The poisons were cortisol and adrenaline, which cortisol and adrenaline are pretty much produced when a child is put into that kind of stressful situation. And I use that term because even I, as a child and growing up, believed that the worst of being hit with the belt is to have it hurt or to have it form the welts that were on my arms and legs. That would eventually go away in a day or two. But now that I really look back and when I wrote the book, it forced me to think in a more intentional way about the feeling that it gave me in my body. Not when I was hit with the belt, but when I knew it was coming. You know, someone broke a vase. I got a bad grade on my math test, and knowing that in a couple hours, my parents were going to know what happened, or in a couple weeks, they were going to get my report card and there was going to be a bad mark, and that I would be beaten. I would get a hot feeling upon reflection on that. Oh my God, they're coming at me with the belt. And that is when the cortisol and all the stress toxins are presented. And I call them poisons because those stress toxins, if you had them in your system and not knowing when they're going to be triggered, but just knowing that at any moment or any time, if I make a mistake, I could be hit with a belt. What that does is it means that for 18 years, you've had those stress toxins in your system, and you're already halfway to a heart attack, stroke, or diabetes because all of these things fuel those chronic diseases that then end up taking life expectancy down 20 years if they're not dealt with through some form of intervention, such as exercise, meditation, and all of the different things that I have done in my life to get distance from those very difficult moments.
Who was Mrs. Bloomer and what did she represent?
She was a teacher, my third grade teacher. And she was a woman who came out of that classic strict tradition that everything you did, big or small, white woman, yeah, they were going to call your parents. And, my mother at the time had gone to a parent-teacher conference and told Mrs. Bloomer, you have the permission. Now, if you need to hit him with the ruler or whatever it is, you go ahead and do it. And to her credit, she never did. But I think one of the reasons she never did it was because she knew that my parents would do it. And what she did was she continued to call my parents all the time. And every time that happened, I was disciplined with the belt. And so, in modern times, you talk about child family services and all that. That wasn't nobody. The only child family service you got was maybe you're going to get a warning that the whooping is coming at 4 o'clock instead of 4:15. But the truth of the matter was, she let me down as a kid because she didn't report. She didn't. There was no intervention. And once again, to be fair, that was the 1980s. And, there's a little bit more of a sophistication there, and development and improvement and progress that we've had along the lines of how we treat children in our society. But Mrs. Bloomer, I think what I did not know was that she dealt with her own problems. And I knew that because there was a time when me and a friend were clowning around and we accidentally knocked down a fan. And she had this reaction to it that was really disproportionately higher than it needed to be. And she started to cry and she said, "What's my husband going to say? What's my husband going to say?" And then in, I think, my junior year in high school, Mrs. Bloomer was actually killed in a murder suicide by her husband. And, I think that was something that really informed me in the way that I understood that she was kind of a nervous woman and she was hyper vigilant as well, kind of like a lot of the nervousness that I saw in my own parents. But what I did not know and what I did not have the sensitivity and the empathy to was that she, in her own way, was a woman who was going through domestic violence, um, which in some ways makes me wonder why she didn't protect me more. But in another way, as I know more about um, America and the role that violence has played, I understand that violence is passed down through the generations in families of all backgrounds, in all colors and races. And I believe that childhood trauma is at the heart of a lot of the problems that we see in our society today in the criminal justice system and beyond. And I believe that it should be first on the president's agenda. And it's something that we should take a serious look at in terms of trying to reverse that and to look at the way that schools and our government codifies the violence that children are up against.
Mr. Hawkins, do you think that Mrs. Bloomer would have reacted differently to what she probably knew was happening at home if you had been white?
Uh, I don't know. I can't say that, In my life, I have never put a lot of faith in the benevolence of white people. And that's because I come from a down home Alabama tradition where um, it just, people never surprise me. But on an individual level, there have been so many examples of people who have defied that wisdom, that cautionary wisdom that you can't trust a white person so many times. I just spent an hour with a high school teacher who drove for an hour to see me, who was one of the reasons I'm sitting here today as an author, my English teacher, who was very much a white teacher. And so I can't vilify her and say that she wouldn't have done that to a white kid because a lot of white kids had it hard too. It was a working class community. A lot of them had it a lot harder than I did in terms of my family was well off compared to some of those kids. And when she died, there was an interesting thing in her obituary where they actually said that she was known to call she was known to call kids' parents. And so I thought, well, maybe it wasn't because I was black. I don't know. But I think what it was that she's just a woman who could not handle um, the clowning that I was doing because I was very bored and feeling not very challenged in her class. Winning spelling bees and stuff, but not really paying attention. And, so what did I do instead? I played around with my friends. And I think she was just a woman who was overwhelmed, and she knew that if she called my parents, they would take care of it. And boy, did they.
It was in Mrs. Bloomer's class that you forged your mother's name, resulting in what you say was the most severe beating of your life at that time.
Yeah. I remember I was struggling in math, which was hard because I don't know. I mean, because I was good in English and spelling and oratory and all of that, um, better than most kids in oratory, because they used to force us to speak at Mount Olivet Baptist Church. They would have us get up and give the welcome of visitors. And at the time, it was just a horrific thing to have to do. But then over time, you learned how to present yourself, how to show up and dress sartorially like you are today, Peter. And it was just, that was the thing. That was the thing back then. And so I just think that she didn't have a lot of patience for me because I was screwing around. I'm sorry, I missed the question.
When you forged your mom's signature.
Right. And so even though I was doing well in those other subjects, I struggled in math. And one of the reasons I struggled in math was because I had a hard time paying attention, because I was, in my own way, a nervous kid. I think a lot of the different punishments that I had taken had made it difficult for me to get calm. And for some reason, reading and writing, I guess it didn't require me to get calm and to really focus that much, because you're using a different part of the brain, which is a very, expressive and, just open part of the brain. And so I wasn't great at math. And so I ended up getting a needs improvement in math en route to the final report card. So she wanted to send a letter home, a pink slip that basically said your son's not doing well in math. And knowing that I was going to get a beating, uh, another thing I was really good at was cursive writing. That was the year they taught that. And I took that pen when I got home and I signed R. Hawkins with the greatest penmanship that was very close to my mother's, probably better than she was. I probably got it closer to my mother's signature than my mother did. And I took that letter back to school and she accepted it. And for weeks, I lived in fear of that parent-teacher conference because my parents went to every conference and I knew that they were going to find out, and they sure did. They found out, and when they got home from the parent-teacher conference, I mean, they weren't talking about you signed my signature without my permission. They were saying forgery. Forgery? You could go to prison for forgery. And so they took this real life consequences approach to something where it wasn't a little boy signing the signature, but it was actually something that I could be held accountable for in my life. And once again, it was based on their fear of me getting caught up in the criminal justice system and their devout belief and understanding that if I made any mistake, something as small as stealing a candy bar at a store, that one day I could be at the height of my career and it could come back to me that when I was a third grader, a fourth grader, a 15-year-old, that I made this mistake, and that could be the thing that could keep me from achieving my dreams, from getting a book deal with HarperCollins. And I guess today, we see the cancel culture. And, there's some element of that, and it comes into play with people of all races. But I've seen it, come into play a lot with black people, and there's a lot of double standards, and I think that scared my parents.
But you were in third grade and you were keeping a suicide diary.
Yeah. I was keeping a diary, and in that diary I did divulge that I felt like taking my own life because I wanted the beatings to stop. Um, And I think that was Peter. Now that I really look back on it, I think that that was my. Even though I didn't verbally become like an activist against corporal punishment, um, it was so normalized in my community. That was the first part of my body revolting. What my mind intellectually would not allow me to do, to dare to challenge my parents for the use of the belt, my body revolted and I started to become depressed. And that was my first real understanding that corporal punishment in the way that it was used in my household and so many households was not fundamental to who we were as black people, and that there was something from a human rights perspective that was wrong about that. We should never underestimate children. I think that children are very perceptive and have a good sense of justice even when they in their moments of fault. There's a purity there, and it just didn't sit right with me. And at that time, I did think about taking my own life.
In your chapter entitled Leroy Chauvin, your last name is Hawkins, in a strange way, even with 15 pounds of plaster and steel weighing me down, all those days without physical attacks or cruelty from my parents were some of my best. What is that reference?
That references a time when I was a kid, a high school kid, and by then, earlier in the story, I'm struggling academically in math, and then the women at the church, the black women at the church, tutored me. It wasn't at school. It was when they took me to a tutoring program at the church, and a lot of them were principals and math teachers and stuff. And I got my grade up, and so shortly thereafter, I started doing a Dr. Martin Luther King speech. Where I had to commit that to memory, and it turned out that I was pretty good at public speaking. And so I guess I hit my stride and I became a student leader. And I was doing a lot of debating and forensics and winning trophies and stuff like that. And so that incident came from a time that my father and I were at the kitchen table and we were having a debate about some issue. And I told, and you have to remember, like if you're an athlete or you're in a student event, you're at your prime, right? And at that time, I was at my probably a better debater, much better debater than I am now as a kid. And I think I hit a chord in my dad when I corrected him and I said, "You got to change your mentality on that." And I used the word mentality, and that was the word that just sent him into a rage. And the next moment, I was on the floor, and my father pressed all his weight on my neck with the foot of his boot. And in that chapter, we learn about that attack. And when I actually went to the doctor later, okay, because I didn't immediately go because I wasn't visibly injured once he let off. I just sat there on the floor and I just heard a slamming door and I just, sat there. And then later on, when I started to have some neck issues, I went into the doctor and it was discovered that I needed to do a surgery that I ended up getting. That was a fusion of two of my vertebrae in my neck. And at the time, I never said anything about what had happened months earlier. And it was decided that it was probably something that happened congenitally, that I was born that way. And I pretty much stuck with that story because I wanted to believe that story myself. And I never talked about it until this book. Um, and I thought it was important to do that. And it was my sister Tiffany that encouraged me by just in a conversation we had just one day, and we were talking about corporal punishment and the way that it was a holdover from slavery. And somehow my neck got brought up, and she said, "Bro, I'm so sorry that happened to you." And we started talking about that day, because my mother was there, my sister was there, and it was never spoken about for years. Her talking about it was the first time that we had ever talked about that moment and whether that had anything to do with the halo cast that I ended up wearing for 4 months and going to school half day.
With holes drilled in your head.
Yeah, it was a plaster cast. They have them today, but I think now they go through the neck. But back then they went through my back, my upper neck. It was a plaster cast that could not be removed, and at the top of the shoulders, they had the big bars that went up, and then it was a halo around, and then it was screwed into my head, and I was like this basically for about 4 months. And I think there's a reference in the book where I talk about the fact that that was the kindest my parents had ever been, that they really took care of me. And I was so happy because I lived in fear of the possibility that they might forget that I was in that cast and that they might touch me, shake me or something and cause more harm to my neck. And so, as I said, I did not want to believe that my father did that. And even today, I think in the book I say, maybe he didn't, but certainly putting all that weight on my neck didn't help. And why did I tell that story? I told that story because, once again, it's critical to understand that while people might be of the mind that strict discipline, physical discipline is a necessity for children. There are a lot of people who believe that we need to bring that back. That's the problem with America today, right? But the thing about that is, particularly in the black community, and this is a controversial thing because a lot of people in my own community still would take issue with me even bringing this up, but it's not even known in the community, so I just don't give a damn. I'm bringing it up. The truth is that children are killed at disproportionately higher rates in the black community by our parents. And a lot of it, I believe, stems from accidental incidents that happen in the context of physical discipline. And, it doesn't take much for a child to hit their head or for someone to slip and fall, and next thing you know, we have a fatality. And so I say that not to pathologize my people. I love my people with all my heart, but I also love the children enough to not lie and say that it doesn't happen in our community as a direct result of a lot of the conditioning and the internalization of American rules that say black children must be beaten in order to keep them in line.
And the Leroy Chauvin chapter obviously refers to the officer who stood on George or kneeled on George Floyd's neck in Minneapolis.
Which has a chilling relevance to this because I grew up there, not far from where George Floyd was killed. And I actually knew people who were there at the time when it happened. I mean, I shouldn't say I knew that one of the women, do you remember the messages scrolling while they were showing the video? Somebody had captured it on their phone and you could see the scrolling come in. One of the people who was scrolling was a Blakey, that was my family. So I was seeing names of family members scrolling while George Floyd was being killed. That's how close I was to that situation in terms of emotionally as well, because that could have been any black person.
Lee Hawkins, in your book, I Am Nobody's Slave, you write that filicide is statistically higher in the black community, going on to write that black on black murder is an internalization of the same racist belief system of white supremacists become enforcers turning against their own.
Yeah. Um, I write a lot about internalization. And when I say internalization, I mean that we can unintentionally take on these belief systems about ourselves and these pathological beliefs and a deep hatred of ourselves. And you know, I grew up in the 1980s at a time in which we marched a lot. We would still march because these were people who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King. And so we marched for Dr. King's birthday to be a national holiday. But we also, what was that all about? It was about nonviolent social change. And our movement for nonviolent social change was about promising white America that we wouldn't be violent in the context of our protests. And that was a very successful movement. Where we stopped was making the promise to ourselves that we will not use violence against our fellow brothers, that we would not use violence against our children. And so, as a student of Dr. Martin Luther King, I still am passionate, if not self righteous, about wanting to see that promise made in American homes of nonviolence, because filicide and homicide, as we say in the black community, is still there. I also marched at the time in the 1980s against black on black crime, which was a term that was accepted back then in the black community and really defined by black people. Later on, I think it became a cocktail party discussion. In a cocktail party discussion, that would be a term that you couldn't use. That someone would say, well, all crime is intraracial. White people kill white people, and Asian people kill Asian people, and it's all about proximity. And so to say black on black crime is racist. And I've been told that by white liberals. And the truth of the matter is, we know that it is disproportionately higher per capita in our community. We've had over 300,000 black men murdered since 1980, which is several times the casualty rate in the Vietnam War. I lost 4 friends in high school, ninth, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. And I have interviewed people and spent time with families who have had sons murdered. Beautiful sons, beautiful people. One young man who was just about to get his PhD from Columbia University, whose both of his parents were incarcerated when he was a kid, and he had dedicated his life, Peter, to helping children of incarcerated parents, and he was killed weeks before he was to get that PhD from Columbia. And so I think, Peter, I'm just about maladjusted enough, again, to take this on as an issue and call it what it is: black on black crime, black on black homicide, as a reflection of the broader system of white supremacy, of which violence was deeply rooted into our American story. And if you really look, when I went back 400 years into the history, I saw all kinds of different manifestations of self-hatred that was taken on from enslavers and people who actually ran the Jim Crow system. And I believe that in the viciousness that I have seen waged against young black men of that period in the 1980s when I was a kid. You know, I was looking over my shoulder for police. Yes, I was very concerned about that. But I also am not going to sit here and lie and say that the chances of me being killed by one of my own brothers wasn't even, tenfold of what the police was. And so once again, it was contributing to that very hyper vigilant, hyper cautious, what's this dude over here going to do? What's this dude over here going to do? Put your hand in your pocket just in case, and that was something that I lived with, was a part of the black American black boy experience. And black on black crime is really a reflection of the political, social, and economic um, injustices in the way that when a young black boy hates himself, when a young black teenager hates himself, he sees his reflection in that other kid that he ends up pulling the trigger on. And I think it's important in the book, it's while it's not written exclusively for black people, I must say that I did write this for healing in our own community so that we can begin to find the language to have the discussion about things that touched us at too tender of a place to discuss. Because I think the big concern, if you talk about white supremacy too, among a lot of black people, is they're afraid to say black on black crime because we don't want to be pathologized. Oh, those people are violent, right? And being so overwhelmingly concerned with what white people think that we don't want to have this discussion. And for me, I believe I don't care what white people think, first of all. And I also believe that if someone is invested in being a racist, they're going to be a racist anyway. Our self-determination in our community is something that has always been there. So I refuse to call it respectability politics, to say that taking accountability for the black community within the black community is something that's off to the right here. No, it's not. It's something that I grew up with, and it's something that we have always done and we will always do. The reason that we're not seeing it now as much in our community is because many of our leaders have accepted the dollar from the political, the powers that be, and from partisanship. And it's time, to return this discussion back to a moral, spiritual place where we can begin the journey of healing from the standpoint of the family, and the standpoint of the individual. And I think that one place that I think that did a wonderful job with that in the past, I know, was the church. I still belong to church today, and I can tell you that that is not an issue that we work hard enough on, yet we still bury the children, and it's time to really get out front on that.
Lee Hawkins, you wrote I Am Nobody's Slave, or were writing this book when both your parents were alive. What was their reaction?
Well, my dad, um, he was happy. He was happy that I was doing this book, um, because I was coming to him every couple weeks with an abundance of new information about our family in Alabama. As I said, Peter, um, every generation kept secrets from the past. And my dad was the baby of the family of 14 kids. And so it was always like, oh, well, you're not going to tell Leroy that, are you? And as a result of that, he even told me in his interview, he said, son, he said, in my life, I was babied a lot. And he said, and I spent the rest of my life paying for that. And so I did this, yes, for myself, but I also did it, as a gift to my dad, because I saw how he reacted. And I also saw, um, you know, in the things that brought joy, where I would bring up the names of cousins. You remember this guy? Why did they call him Dough Belly? Why did they call this guy Jughead? And he would say, well, everybody had a nickname down there, and it was very true. Even in my family, we had Aunt Toopy, Aunt Weenie, Uncle Mook, and everybody down south.
Grandma Charity?
Yeah, everybody has a nickname. And so um, I was bringing up like a lot of names that my dad hadn't heard in years because he left Alabama under very, very tragic circumstances when his mom died when he was 12. And so um, it became a partnership of sorts. And so he was very happy. My mother told me she was the one who really had the most problem with me talking about the corporal punishment of my childhood because, to be fair, I did come from a loving family. I came from a family that was very close knit and very involved and prominent in the community. And I think that those kinds of secrets, even though corporal punishment was all over the place and everybody was getting the belt, my mother still was very concerned about the image. And it's so funny because even to this day, she's more inclined to worry about, oh, what other people next door going to think about what you wrote, as opposed to what other people on C-SPAN going to think, because we're on C-SPAN right now and the world is seeing this. But I think that to her credit, she sat for the interviews. For her credit, we had some very difficult conversations in which she revealed to me that my father came to bed many nights after doing interviews with me with tears in his eyes. And he would say, oh, that boy is taking me through so much, right? And it was, very complicated emotions, a mixture of emotions. And I think to really put the real truth into this answer, we have to accept that, yes, it's a very difficult book to read, to write. There were many days I didn't get out of bed. I couldn't get out of bed. It's a difficult book to read, but it also is cloaked in complexity, right? In the kind of complexity that we really need to apply to our families, the kind of complexity that we need to apply to our country. Because to look at people and say, well, my dad beat me with the belt when I was a kid, and as a result, he was a terrible father, or my mother, slapped me, or my mother verbally abused me that time when she said this or that. That means that she didn't do her job as a mother. And I think that because we're taught to not look at things through the lens of complexity. America is, a genocidal, racist country that never believed in equality, without recognizing that there wasn't a black person in the Congress or the Senate when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. So what does that mean? Yes, there are periods and many, many incidents of genocidal governmental behavior in our past. No doubt, there's slavery, there's all of these things, but there's also these glimmers of hope that we have seen, these glimmers of American excellence that have brought us together at critical times where we needed to move forward and make this a more perfect union. And the same thing applies to the family. When my mother took care of me when I was in the hospital, the hard working of my parents, the times where I knew that my dad, was there when I was playing in a baseball game or I was delivering a speech. The joy that my father shared with me when I told him that I was going to be covering General Motors for the Wall Street Journal. And so it's that complexity that you have to take into account. And we have to look at this process of family healing and using genealogy to ask the tough questions and to bring families together and to talk to our elders about the difficult things that happened when we were kids, that we have to do it through the lens of curiosity, which I believe is the highest form of love, as opposed to vilification. Why did you do this? What did you do? Well, what was happening at that time when I was beaten? And when I did that, I was finding out about the horrific racism that my dad was experiencing on his job and a lot of the different things that he was going through. And so the complexity and the nuance, this is a story, a family narrative that tells American history through the lens of one Black American family, and with a boy who finally as a man was able to accept that 2, 3, 4, 5 things can be true about a parent, and imperfect people are not unlovable. And I'm so happy for that because I'm not perfect either.
The book is called I Am Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. The author, Lee Hawkins. We appreciate the hour you've given us.
Thank you. This is a childhood dream come true. C-SPAN, Lee Hawkins finally made it. God bless you, buddy.
All Q&A programs are available on our website or as a podcast on our C-SPAN Now app.